Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Myth and Pop Cult, our show where we talk about magic, the mysteries in popular culture. And I'm joined today by my special guest and good friend, Pierrot. How's it going, Pierrot?
Pretty good. Pretty stressed, okay? But
Yeah,
I'm good.
yeah. Sorry, everyone, for the time delay there. We were having some technical issues and just wasn't
Yeah,
working, giving Pierrot the hardest of times.
yes. But
But
thank you for the
we're here. It's
patience.
all good. So today we're going to be talking about someone, and this is exciting for me, is Grace Jones. So actually, this is kind of an interesting one, is because you, Perot, actually recommended her, but you didn't even really know a lot of her stuff prior.
No, you know what it is? I'm just gonna get this out of the way right now. I've my new it's like a newfound sort of love that I have for Grace Jones. I think because she's so iconic, just so deniably iconic, like almost like the definition of iconic. And I don't know much about her. And then once I started getting interested in her, I started seeing that a lot of people kept saying that the world has not kept caught up to her genius. And that's something that I really felt also was like pulling me towards her. So I'm excited to learn about like everything, because right now I'm just in awe of who she is as a person rather than like knowing everything about her magic.
Exactly. Like I was in a very similar boat. Like I knew some of her hit songs, especially like the bigger ones like Nightclubbing and I Need a Man, stuff like that I'd heard before. But and then I knew her like you did as an icon, as this image, right? People would always react to this image. I have a really young memory of my dad seeing Conan and my dad going ooh and my mom going badass. She tended to really spark reactions from people. And she's also one of the few people I can think of who, especially a black woman who's bending those gender binaries as well, is so kind of like transgressive in every way.
Yeah, absolutely. Mostly so I think that this is going to be interesting because I'm mostly drawn to her as an icon, like as a sort of like a fashion reference more than anything, even though I don't really consider her to be like a model, or a musician or really anything other than just like an entity in and of herself. Like she sings, she models, she does different things, she acts, but she's not really like an actress,
Well,
or she is,
after
but
after I did the deep dive into her, trying to figure this out, trying to figure out the enigma that is Grace Jones,
right.
I would definitely put her as a musician first and foremost, right?
There you
Like
go.
that becomes the central focus of her career, really. And like she kind of finds herself on the dance floor, like literally her words kind of thing. And the other thing with Grace
Nice.
Jones is it's like she never wanted to be boxed into anything. So she kind of, anytime anyone tries to box her in, she rebels and leaves and kind of does something more radical. This is like an ongoing theme for her. This theme of like transformation and this aggression. Like she is such an aggressive, go-getting type figure. It's really kind of impressive to see. Like to the point where like when you first brought her up, it was funny because I had just seen her in the news like a few months ago because she had turned 75, I think like 3 months ago now. And for her 75th birthday, she walks the Paris runway and performed a show with a hula hoop in massive high heels,
Yeah,
singing to
yeah.
tens of thousands of people, right? Like, who else is doing that for their 75th birthday?
Yeah. Stretching a 7 minute song into like 20 minutes while she's hula hooping, while she's walking up, yeah, that's very, at 75, like who else?
And she's just like when you see her, she's such a master of it, right? Anyone who understands like performance. This is the thing I actually like. Since she was a musician, first and foremost, she's a performance artist. Everything she does is about that. You mentioned like we see her as an object often, or people know her as an object. She plays into that objectification. She uses that to her advantage, right? It's like
Right.
it becomes like this thing with her of like, I'm beautiful, I'm ugly, I'm neither male nor female. Like, I'm forcing you to like be confused so that I can define myself, and you don't even like the tropes and all of the BS that you bring. You can't really apply to me because I'm so alien, you know. But that image, it's interesting too. That image we think of Grace Jones is a complicated one because it's also one that develops over her career, and it comes from multiple places. You know, the other thing with Grace Jones, which is a major facet of her and her magic, is that she acts as a muse, where she inspires people creatively, and then works with them and incorporates their art into hers. You know, so this is like she works with others and then transforms herself, and she knows how to bring people together, you know.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to, I think, again, like that's the main thing that I get with Grace Jones is how she's able to sort of, it's hard not to be inspired by such an iconoclastic person. You know, it's not even just an image, it's like like a living, breathing, creative force in one person. And yes, she is so alien, but at the same time, I feel like it's so like if you're not really trying to pin her down to anything, like a time period or a location or anything like that, then you really get to like experience Grace Jones. I mean, of course, she's not completely removed from all of those things, but she does like like transformative aspect of her work, I guess, is so like it's so transcendent from all of those things. And I think it was so like so avant-garde, like literally avant-garde, that again, like we have not caught up to her genius. Like people are
Yeah.
not talking and discussing how incredibly iconic she is.
Well, for example, something that I found out, like I'm not really into a lot of the intense pop culture that's centered around a lot of the fashion stuff. So a lot of this I was not aware of until I started looking into this. But like her long-term partner and the father of her child is John Paul Gode, who they become incredible collaborators, you know, and they really become each other's muses and drive each other's career forward. But John Paul Gode has continued to work within the pop culture sphere, and he's continued to use that same evocative imagery with other people. Like he recently, or well, not recently, I guess 4 or 5 years ago, he photographed Kim Kardashian, but he recreated scenes he had done with Grace Jones back in the 70s and the 80s. So there's that famous scene where her butt is sticking out and she's shooting champagne into the bottle. There's a version of that with Grace Jones, you know, like verbatim.
Yeah, it's and really what they're doing is they're trying out like all of these different paste up and mechanical techniques, which is basically just like you know, handwork Photoshop where they're like taking exactos and like cutting them and extending her and reshaping her in order to create these like really iconic images. And then what happens is because they are so iconic that they become like a touchstone of like if you want to kind of get your boons in as a creative person, you have to kind of show and signal that you know these references. And the references are Grace Jones.
Exactly, right? And like I read her I went out and I read her memoirs, which I cannot recommend enough. I read them in a single day and then went and read them again. You know, so
Okay.
it's like a spoken conversation. It's so much fun. You really get invested with her. But what she talks about this with this part with and she asks because she's still close with John Paul. You know, he's her baby's father, and they're still good friends and collaborators. And he asked her like, why would you cheapen your art for Kim Kardashian? And he comes out and says, Kim said that she was going to rip me off, and I can either be a part or I could not. So
Yeah, yeah, that Kim Kardashian tactic, I feel like, is definitely one we maybe want to discuss. It's just hard to not be vitriolic about it when discussing it because it pisses me off so much, to be
Right.
honest. But just to say that, I think that it's not about cheapening the art. It's about maybe looking at Kim Kardashian trying to elevate herself. Because again, if you want to, this is at a time where she was with Kanye, and she was definitely trying to get her fashion, like game up,
Taken
right? Because she
seriously,
needed
yeah.
to show up with him, who what he is and was so influential in fashion. That she needed to make that leap, right? And how was she going to do that? It's by referencing Grace Jones. It's what you have to do in a way. Like you need to show that you are looking at like your past or whatever, and people who have come before you, and kind of be like a herald for that vision going into the future, which I don't think Kim Kardashian is. I think she just kind of took it and made it, and it stole it, honestly. I know that she worked with John Paul Gold. I don't care. But that's what you need to do is like it's sort of like you need to reference, I guess is that
Of
polite,
course.
non-magical way of saying it. But of course we know that there's much more to it than that.
There's everyone does this. If you're going to try to enter any kind of genre where you want to be taken seriously by those who appreciate the genre as aesthetes, you have to speak the language of the genre. So you're right, right? She had to reference Grace Jones, and she also wanted to do something incredibly provocative and sexual. And it's kind of wild that in our modern times, John Paul Gold is still just as radical. Right? He can recreate an image that he did in the late 70s, early 80s, and have it still cause a controversy and still become a meme.
Yeah, and it became iconic for Kim Kardashian. I mean, if you're going to make references to Kim Kardashian, kind of like let's do a retrospective on Kim Kardashian's career, we would have to touch down on that cover. It was a paper
Yeah.
magazine cover. We need to discuss that break the internet moment, which broke the internet.
Right.
So
And it's like, think about this, is that Grace Jones was breaking those kind of things before there was even an internet, you know? And these things took a while. Like it's interesting to see when you see these images start to come out in her career, because unlike today, she's able to reuse images and really evoke the power of them because they don't have that mass market saturation right away that they did before, and she's able to play into that mystery of it. But we're going to start here with but you say what you're going to say. I'm just going to bring up our pictures here to start.
no, I was just gonna agree. Oh, this is gonna be fun. Okay, wow, right away.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with this one because this is Grace at her 75th birthday party. She's also doing a product placement for her own brand of drink that's in between her legs there. Gotta work it, like a true goddess and businesswoman. But yeah, 75 years old. This is who she is in her armor, ready to take on the world just as much as she ever was. So I wanted to start with this image to show you where she is at today. Now we're going to go back to where she came from. So she doesn't give an exact, oh, well, actually, we got one more image here. This is also from 2021. So this is her in full Lady Babylon garb with the one exposed breast, invoking the skull of the mother goddess, that death image, with that Keith Harington body paint, just rocking it. Just a wild figure. So that's who she is today. Let's see where she came from. So this is Grace at 11 years old in Spanish Town, Jamaica. She's the center person here in a portrait. Now, so Grace, she comes from an immigrant family in Jamaica, and her story is actually quite a sad one. She's born in the late 50s, either 58 or 59, and she came up in a very Pentecostal family. And we're talking like extreme Pentecostal religion. Her father was a preacher. Her grandparents were preachers. It was like a very intense thing in her life. Her father had his own church, and the way she describes it in her book, basically he had to start his own church in order to gain his own authority and to have freedom from the oppression of his own father. And this was kind of a thing that was happening in Jamaica at this time, where all of these different people were starting their own churches, creating their own views on the Bible, and were competing with each other on these pulpits where they were preaching. And she talks about her father as this really interesting kind of like duality in her life. On one hand, this extreme austere figure who she sees as this terrifying man who's yelling on the pulpit. But at the same time, her father was never mean to her, never told her she wasn't allowed to do things and stuff like that, and always supported her, even as she got later. But even later, as her career went even more and more insane. And it was actually very detrimental to him throughout his life as a preacher. But he always kept a picture of her. And, you know, the issues, though, with their time in Jamaica were really from the extended family. Like her upbringing really came from her grandparents, from her maternal grandmother and her grandfather's, her maternal grandmother remarried to a man named they call him Mass P or Master P. His name was Patrick, but he was a notoriously abusive, horrific figure in Grace's life. He abused all of the children, but he would actually have belts that he would have, one for each of the kids, wouldn't allow them to attend anything. They couldn't go out and talk to people who weren't of their church, couldn't go to movies, couldn't do much of anything. So Grace really had this horrific kind of fearful childhood. And it really aggravated up at a point when she was in her teenage years. Her parents relocated to the US and she was stuck in Jamaica living with her grandmother in Mass P. And he would just beat her violently. But luckily she had some loving aunts and sisters in her life. And this really kind of instilled in her this like incredible resolve and this incredible ability to overcome violence, you know. So basically she wound up spending 3 years under the oppression of this Master P figure before her parents brought her to America to come live with them once they had enough money. And here's a quote I wanted to share from her. So it's pretty intense. It says, "Eventually I realized it wasn't me who was wrong. It was them. The way it works is they make you feel that you deserve to be punished. You are somehow encouraged to think that it is a necessary part of life, that you need the discipline. Therefore, you must be worthless. Or why would this be happening to you? It is crippling to your self-esteem. I hung on. I wouldn't let myself be harmed. I didn't want to think that I was weak. I would think of myself as the master. I made sure that I loved myself because at times it seemed no one else was loving me. That's carried on. It's definitely one of my personalities. One boyfriend told me that I loved myself too much. I thought, well, you can love a boyfriend too much, but you can't love yourself too much. Sometimes you have to love yourself to keep yourself whole." You know, so that kind of extreme violence and repression in her youth really kind of colors her throughout her whole life and instilled in her this amazing like desire to rebel and to just challenge all authority, you know? And what ends up happening with her on her story, it's kind of interesting, is she relocates to the US with her parents. And she starts going to a college there because in Jamaica, she went to like private schooling, Christian schooling, and they were so intense that she wound up graduating a couple years early and then wound up going to college at like 16. So she's super young in America, going to college, learning all this stuff. And while she's there, she winds up hooking up with these guys who get her to become involved in theater. And this is sort of the first love of her life, is really discovering performance and discovering that she can be really provocative through performance. And one of these guys that she meets up with gets her to join this thing called the Summer Stock. Now, this was like a famous musical at the time that was like really popular with Judy Garland and Gene Kelly. But her and these hippies that she became friends with in college would travel around various states and would do these summer performances of this particular play. And while she was doing all of this is where she really kind of comes into her own and has kind of her first drug experiences, you know? So And she really credits both kind of like the intensity of her youth, but then also these kind of rebirth experiences through drugs as making her the person she becomes. So I have a few different quotes here that I wanted to read from her book just because it was so awesome. And I want to get your thoughts on this, Pierrot. So she says, "The first time I took acid at a hippie commune, there was a doctor with us to make sure that it was not done too recklessly. In these communes, your first acid trip was a rite of passage. It was almost an initiation you had to go through in order to be accepted. It was part of a general shedding of your old life, designed to make your past seem very remote. It wasn't about partying. It was part of a series of experiments under observation. These hippie communes were all about creative and personal growth, a celebration of expression, the total opposite of how growth and expression had been stunted in Spanish Town. I remember waking up a wall and walking into it, and it was full of flowers. The petals spun like sparks. A maze of trees headed off infinitely in every direction. Fireflies scattered through the grass. I could hear the earth breathing. There was an eternity between breaths. I became a naked winged woman perched at the prow of a ship, the figurehead of a ship, embodying its spirit, the woman, eyes bright, that they put there to calm gales and storms. And the ship was partying, not water, but snakes of some sort, serpents and writhing creatures. And this ship was at the head of would break through. It was wet and turbulent. Oops, sorry, one second. It was wet and turbulent, but not like the sea. And I was slicing through all this mysterious motion, powering through the snakes, guiding the ship to safety. That's a pretty intense image, eh?
Which one? There's so many, and they're all intense. And they and like not only is it like it makes so much sense for Grace Jones, but it's also like, do we see the type of like experiences, especially like in on LSD, on psychedelics, that somebody who becomes as iconic as Grace Jones has? I mean, it's pretty, if you watch like a lot of your work or like Amon's work, or if you're interested in anything like Carl Ruck's work and stuff, like you see it, right? Like you see what's going on here.
Oh yeah, well, like let's just I want to break this down because, like, if we apply some of this Orphic Vox to this, she's not just having an initiation; she was initiated, right? You know, she's walking past a wall full of flowers, right? This is that rebirth, breaking out of the overgrowth. This is a constant image that you see. The fireflies and scattering of the grass, hearing the earth, right? Like this is a birth out of that womb of nature, you know?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
She became a naked winged woman perched at the prow of a ship, the figurehead of a ship, embodying its spirit, the woman eyes bright, that they put there to calm gales and storms. And the ship was like, can we please, like, is Amon listening? Like,
right? This is such Lady Babylon type imagery.
right.
We know that oftentimes the boats, these ships, are not simply ships of the sea, but are ships of the mind, or ships of space. They travel through the planes, they go to the underworld and back, and that thing traveling through the snakes, calming the seas, right? What does Lady Babylon do? She controls the snakes, right?
Yeah. I wish I had a Ouija board so I can summon Amon right now so he could see this. But yeah, there you go. It's incredible in every
Right?
way.
So it's also so evocative of her life, right? She becomes the figurehead of her own ship, right? That other people are going to help pilot, but she is that main force going through, right? This artistic image. It's really profound. So here's another quote. I still walk around having the kind of grandiose thoughts you might have on an acid trip, but without being perpetually inside the trip. That's a good balance. Becoming aware of how far your mind can expand, but understanding that it doesn't have to expand all the time. Taking acid under supervision taught me to be careful of true extremes. Extreme, but in moderation. Crazy out there, but within reason. Take nothing in your body without being completely fussy. Be very aware. And that 3D trip taught me to be my own shrink. You know?
Yeah, I totally agree with being super careful and super just like really know what's gonna uh, like really set yourself up, I guess, um, to have these kinds of experience so that way you can get the most out of them, right? Because it can go bad pretty quickly if you don't have sort of like I don't want to say guardrails as much, but not guardrails of your mind, but guardrails like of your general, I don't know, general vibes, I guess, right? Like, I don't know what better word to use.
Well, what it is that drugs put you out of balance. Okay, drugs put you into a hyper state, right? They break the barriers down so that you can perceive differently. This is a
Yeah,
good thing for a certain amount of time, but
it's the point.
fundamentally puts you out of balance, right?
Right.
And some people, what happens is they have these extraordinarily profound experiences. And I'm not saying they're not profound, but you have that experience. And then you want to have it again and again and again. So then you become chasing after that experience, but that becomes a trap. You know, anyone who pursued drugs realizes pretty quickly that you can't pursue the same experience. And that's not, you know, that's a trap in and of itself. And you really have to balance these things out. Like Ammon always talks about dote and antidote. You know, it needs to be a balance, you know? And like it gets so wild later on with Grace Jones because she talks about this a lot. She becomes such an intense drug user at one point in her life when she's at Studio 54 and she's like this disco queen and hanging out with Andy Warhol. But even at her most debaucherous, she's talking about how she was checking all her drugs. She wasn't going as insane as people think. Like she wasn't as crazy as a coke fiend that people made her out to be. Never was she shooting hard drugs. She was aware of everything that she was doing. She partied and probably partied too hard. She'll even admit that. But she never went to those points where she was putting herself in like serious like death states, you know, or like risk of death, you know?
Okay.
And like we have to be careful, right? Like this is the thing with drugs is that you have to use these things to fuel you to do something else, you know, to be creative within the world. If you just use it and get stuck within the self, that's also a problem, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, so here's another quote that I wanted to read that I really liked. It said, "If I feel something, I feel it strongly, and I follow the instinct. I think the acid enriched my senses, made them all seem more sensitive, heightened my emotional and mental processes, or at least made me aware that they could be heightened and accelerated. I think the strong feeling I have about things derive from those acid trips. They do make you into a different person. You see other possibilities. I was born again. This is me. Turn me loose." So again, just
Yeah.
like born again, and she can fundamentally like she gained something. She gained the perception of reality where she can perceive the universe differently, where she can actually perceive the future to a certain extent, you know?
Yeah. And sort of use these experiences to kind of like go into the future or use these experiences in order to build the future. I think that this is kind of like, you know, anybody who has done any kind of psychedelic and kind of vouch and had like really incredible experiences can vouch that this is sort of like a universal, I think.
Oh, for sure. So let's keep going here. So after her time, so yeah, this is more. So after her time with the hippies, where she was working doing the theater, after she had those profound experiences on acid, it gave her this new sense of like daring and boldness. And she decided with one of her girlfriends and with her brother, who was gay, to relocate to New York and to try and make it within the fashion world, and to try and to do something that her parents and everyone said was insane and crazy. So she took this massive risk. She went with her, like, her and her brother had nothing. They bought one of these small studio apartments, and she just tried. She put her name out there. In the book, she talks about how she went to dozens of different agencies and no one would look at her. And oftentimes back then, when you could get into these like auditions, what they would do is they just stand you in front of a white screen and take a shot, you know, and her being someone who's of dark complexion, and just, it did not work. You know, these artists weren't paying attention to her, and they would just snap a picture and she'd be completely whited out. She'd never get any work. It was like this incredibly frustrating experience for her. But at the same time, she was like really connecting to this burgeoning kind of disco and art scene with her brother, and connecting to the gay community there, and started to make a lot of connections. And through persistence, eventually she was able to get her first couple gigs in the US. So her first gig, this is her first published work, is for this Chamber Brothers magazine. And you can see, like, this is far from the Grace Jones that we know. You know, this is her in his stereotypical African kind of black soul imagery, as you can imagine, right? It's pretty funny.
Yeah, this is it's very strange. I feel like it's kind of like looking at Grace Jones trying to do JC Penney. I mean, she didn't even stand out to me at all. It's almost like, you know, what a joke to think that she would go to maybe like a open casting call for some kind of like runway show or something, and they'd take a Polaroid picture of her, and she would be so dark that they couldn't even see what she looked like, and just completely reject her. Like Grace Jones, you know, like this is not even, it's kind of sad in a way to like think about, you know?
It's so sad, right? Like so much, so much is about right place and right time with the right people and connecting in the right way. And we'll see this in Grace. So this is her second
Wow.
shoot that she did, also in the US, you know. So this is a little bit more what we would come to know with the short hair and the, you know, but still not not that iconic Grace, right?
But what a stunning picture, specifically the middle one is like really stunning to me. Yeah, like
Well,
that.
she always had the incredible features, the bone structure and that long, tall body, you know. She just needed to find the right people. So after she starts doing these photo shoots, some people do start to notice. She starts to make connections within the New York scene, specifically through her brother and through the music scene. And eventually she meets up with this gentleman here. This is Antonio Lopez, I believe his name is. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Pierrot, but when I was looking him up, he's like an ultra famous fashion illustrator. And him and Grace Jones became really good friends. Yeah, Antonio Lopez is his name.
Oh, yeah, that does ring a bell actually. I didn't realize it at first, like I didn't really catch, but yeah, when you said that he's a fashion illustrator, I think I know what you're talking about. He did like, you know, back in the day, they would do a lot of fashion illustrations like for publications and stuff, and he kind of became the standard from what I understand, right?
Pretty much. So I'll show you some of his art here.
And he's
So
like Chilean or something.
yeah, mixed, and like a really interesting figure. So he was at the time doing all of these art kind of drawings for all of the big magazines, all the big fashion magazines. And he was working out of both New York and Paris. And he had this fascination with African women. Specifically, he really liked that Josephine Baker look. And when he met Grace Jones, he saw a similar image in her and started to draw her in like as Josephine Baker. This is one of the first things he drew of her, and then drew her as like an African queen.
Yeah,
And
you
sort of,
know,
go
sorry,
ahead.
that parallel is really profound because again, there's sort of like a torch being passed from from legacy to legacy, and you can see how Josephine Baker kind of laid out a blueprint for somebody like Grace Jones to come in and do her thing. So I think that it's so like this guy, he caught it,
100%. This is the thing. He saw what no one else was seeing. And it's because I think he's operating in these two worlds, both the US and Paris. And he recognized immediately, he's like, you need to go to Paris. The Parisian audience is going to love you.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And he kept pushing her and pushing her and pushing her. And eventually, after a lot of this is an iconic image he drew of her later, when she's in full Grace Jones kind of mystique. But just so awesome. But yeah, so eventually he convinces her to take a risk and to go to Paris. And it's insane. When she goes to Paris, we're talking night and day. She talks about how in under a year, she's working for most of the major Paris fashion houses. She's walking all of the major runways, and people are fighting over her. This is one of her first images when she goes there. And just compare what they're doing in Paris to what they were kind of doing in New York over here, right?
Yeah, so in fashion, the different locations, they actually um, they mean different things in fashion. So, Paris is in one way is like extremely traditional, but in another way, they sort of really revere extremes, and they really revere things that aren't necessarily commercial. And what happens with somebody like Grace Jones, and this is kind of a pattern that you see in fashion history, or in the history of the industry in general, is that in the U.S. people really struggle to market using dark skinned women because nobody saw the beauty in that. Well, not enough to bring in the money. So what they would do is that you would always need to look whiter or lighter or more, like you would never use sort of like your like this prowess that you can see Grace Jones like really utilizing in Europe in the US, because it wasn't seen as appealing to sell product. So in Paris, they kind of set the tone also for what it is, and they really embrace extreme beauty. Like they embrace ethnic um, features and everything like that. Whereas in the US, where you're trying to do more like much setting the standard for trends or beauty, they kind of diffuse that, and it still happens to this day. Like this is what's really sad, is that this is still what's happening. So the Europeans honestly have been, I mean, yes, do they still have like issues with some of this stuff? Yes, but they've always been ahead of the curve when it comes to embracing like different types of beauty rather than standardizing it in order to sell product.
100%. Just look at our media figures here in the West. Like we have a type, you can always pick out those blonde haired, blue eyed girls with the pearl necklaces. Like it's 2020, it's 2023. Why do we still have 1,000 of these women on every single network who look the exact same? Like, I don't mean, like, I'm not shaming anyone, but
We love them. They're beautiful all the same, right?
yeah, exactly. But we have this very cookie cutter image that people are not allowed to move out of, right?
Right.
Whereas in a place like Paris, they really want that. They really value that art.
Yeah.
One thing that sticks out to me is you look at someone like Iman, right? Not very well known in America, but like ridiculously big in France.
Yeah, yeah, and with Josephine Baker too, because Josephine
Right.
Baker, for all her Americanness, was put on a stage and made this. She's buried at the Pantheon, of
Yeah.
Paris, of France, and I think she's the only Black woman to be. And this is the woman who used to put around, bananas around her waist and stuff and dance around. Um, uh, and so you can always see, you can see how, like, yeah, you go to Paris because they're going to understand, and they're going to, like, they're not going to try to, like, put you down in order to sell product. They're going to, utilize, like, the best of what you got in order to, well, to make your career, really.
Right. So yeah, so she comes to Paris, and immediately they take to her and they start using her in this evocative way. And being Grace Jones, she immediately does what Grace Jones does, and she got involved into the club world and started going. Like, at this point, it's not really disco. Okay, this is kind of disco is a word that comes out of France, out of the discotheques, out of these places where they would play American soul records, and they would, whatever they could get. They tend to, at this time, they really love the more upbeat bubblegum rhythms. But what we understand is disco doesn't even yet exist. But while she's in Paris, she hooks up with these two incredible women who I'm sure many of you will recognize. We have, on the left is Jessica Lange, famous actress and model. And then on the other side, we have Jerry Hall. Now, the three of these women became roommates in Paris at this time, all working at various fashion houses, and all were notorious discotheque like killers. Like, there are infamous stories of these women where they would go to 3 or 4 discotheques in a single night and then take men home and pass them around between each other. Just wild stories of debauchery and insanity.
Yeah, how, like, crazy iconic is that?
Right.
Jessica, like, could you imagine Jessica, like, they just show up together and then they go home together. They're going, like, to the same clubs. Like, what a trifecta. And
Right.
yeah, Jerry Hall, again, iconic for, riding the white horse, which kind of becomes synonymous with, you know, doing some white things and, in disco clubs. And then you have Jessica Lange, who plays into the witch imagery later in her life. By the way, I've seen Jessica Lange in person one time, passed me by in New York. Couldn't believe it.
Oh, wow.
Tiny, yeah, tiny woman. Um, and then you have fucking Grace Jones. I mean, what a crazy, wow.
Right.
It's hard
Those
to,
three
like,
energy
yeah,
together. Just,
incredible.
you can imagine the kind of power that these women had and what they were getting up to. The sky was the limit. They could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah,
So at this point, Grace is kind of coming into fruition, and she's starting to generate a lot of attention. And this is where she meets one of the most influential figures of her life. And you may recognize this person. It's Issei Miyake, who's a famous fashion
yes,
designer.
yeah.
And this is another one. This is an ongoing theme. So first you had Antonio Lopez, who chose Grace as his muse and inspired her to go to Paris. Now Issei Miyake chooses Grace as his muse and kind of really inspires her to take on the beginnings of this androgynous look that we know her for. He gets her to shave her head, and he gets her to really embrace theatrics. So a big thing he does is he shows her kabuki theater, which she absolutely falls in love with. And from then on out, she insists on doing a lot of her own makeup and always incorporate a lot of this kabuki eyeshadow into everything she did. And this is the first shoot she did with Issei Miyake in 1975. And this was a Greek-inspired shoot, apparently. Not the best picture, but it was one of the only ones I could find from this era.
I've never seen this picture before, and seeing this is so, like, you still get the intensity of Grace Jones, but then you get this kind of Grecian and then with the whole Issei Miyake thing, I didn't really look at it so much. I didn't know their relationship, so I'm just in awe of what you're saying right now. Yeah, Issei Miyake actually has come up in our show before. In the Yoko Ono
Yes.
episode, we mentioned him. I love this. You can see the pleats in the outfit is iconic to Issei Miyake. So he's iconic Issey Miyake like fabric techniques with iconic, like they're making magic together. Yeah,
Right.
incredible
And
photo that they did together.
what's right?
You said this is the first photo they ever did together.
Yeah, this is the first photo shoot. She did this the Grecian inspired theme. There was 2 or 3 photos in the
Perfect,
magazine. I think it was like
perfect.
French Cosmopolitan. It's all in her memoirs. It's really awesome.
Yeah, Issey Miyake also, which was kind of why I brought him up in the Yoko Ono show, is that he doesn't really reference things. He's more about techniques and kind of playing around with materials rather than making references, like cultural references. So that's really interesting.
Right? He immediately was drawn to her and wanted to incorporate that powerful image into his work. And he inspired her. She said that he was one of the most inspiring people she had ever met. And she had this to say about kabuki, which he introduced her to. So, kabuki, meaning is to act eccentrically or erratically. Kabuki give me clues about how to achieve the spectacular without appearing obvious. I got to it after being in America, then Paris, and that was the right order. A crash course in pop culture and hippie adventure on the East Coast, a year of getting up to speed amid the make it here frenzy of New York, a discovery of provocative French passions, and then spinning all this through the dazzling Japanese combination of formality and subversion. It taught me a way of being larger than life without losing control. The way they used their cross-eyed glare and stuck out their tongues to drive away evil meshed with a lot of what I felt about Jamaica and the way I was brought up. I like the idea that you could repel badness through a look, a held moment. There's an element of the African trickster too, introducing disorder and confusion, but paving the way for a new, more dynamic order. That's pretty powerful, eh?
Fantastic. My God.
And I just wanted so that our audience can understand some of the references. This is a traditional kabuki makeup and outfit. And if you look at the eyes especially, you can see how much that kind of makeup played into Grace Jones. And especially, like she says, with all of the facial gestures of anger and intensity, right? And kabuki, what they'll do is it's not enough to strike a pose. They'll yell, strike a pose, and then hold it, like a tableau, so that the audience really experiences it.
Yeah, it's also kind of it's interesting that she said in her quote that she liked the idea of this image being used to ward off evil, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way that the cross-eyed glare, stunk out their tongues, whatever. That's you can see that in use with like the image of Medusa as well, or the Gorgons in the Greek Greek thought, right? And
100%.
um, so to me, I always saw this kind of like this very threatening sort of like warding off evil um, energy coming out of like basically all of Grace Jones' work, you know.
Right.
So to me, I see her as like a Gorgon figure in a way, and I mean that with all the respect that it deserves.
For sure. No, she's a guardian, right? It's she's definitely evocative of that powerful feminine energy. I really like that she references the African trickster as well, because we see a lot of these figures like in Voodoo and in similar religious ideologies. And
Yeah,
oftentimes, one of the things they'll tell you in Voodoo is the spirits appear to you in the most terrifying, violent ways. And often, the more terrifying, the more violent the spirit, the more likely they are to be nice to you, the more likely they are to be kind. Like that image that they put forward is to ward off evil. Not if you can resist it and see the truth behind that facade, they reward you. There's all of this stuff going on here, because she isn't this angry figure, even though she is at the same time. It's that Dionysian mirroring as well, right?
hmm
Yeah, I absolutely love it. So she's in Paris. She's made up with Issei. She's invoking the kabuki. And now at the same time, she's getting these opportunities to get involved in the discotheque scene. So while she's in Paris, she's partying like crazy with her girlfriends, and she happens to just kind of get roped up into the scene where someone offers her, do you want to record a song? And they gave her a couple different songs to choose, and she really liked this one, I Need a Man, and she wanted it to be a kind of a disco kind of soul bop. If you go back and you listen to it, especially the original version, it's really cheesy. She doesn't sound very good as a singer. She hasn't developed her singing style yet. And the song isn't even really disco. Like, this really kind of is like the formulation of it. But what's wild is this song becomes this whole big underground sensation in Paris. Okay? Because this is, even though it's Paris, it's still the 70s, and queerness is still very, very underground. And she kind of played up her masculine image and really played to a gay audience. Her brother was gay. She had lots of gay friends, you know, and it became one of the first gay jams that we can think of coming out of the discotheques, you know, like the first kind of like big diva kind of thing where all of these men started to worship her and follow her around, you know?
Yeah, the interesting thing about queer people is that they held positions of power, like extreme power, in these kinds of circles. And so they were basically the ones that got to bring up, you know, whoever was going to be next by playing their music, and also by like giving them attention and giving them, you know, like it was like you really had to kind of get in with them in order to make anything of yourself. Um, so, you know, not only have they always been there, not only have queer people always been there, but they've also been responsible for like, you know, to being like early adapters in some of the biggest iconic like superstars that we know of. Like,
when you look into queer history, it's always super interesting to me how a lot of the partiers, a lot of the fashion icons, no matter the era, are queer people, whether they're gay, lesbian, non-binary, trans. It's like a thing, you know. It's just how it's always been, you know. It's kind of something that queer culture has gravitated towards. It's a way for them to influence power, you know. Like a lot of the time, there's all these stories of these gay men who would befriend royalty and throw them parties and make them fashion. And that's always kind of been the thing, you know?
yeah, and they made good choices. So here we are.
Right? There you go. You know, and queer culture has always been here. It may be underground, but it's a lot more setting the pace for things than we give credit, you know? Because again, like we're talking, this is before disco, right? She's having a disco diva jam before disco is even really a thing.
Yeah, ahead of her time.
So where she really starts to take off is with the disco stuff, is with this gentleman here, Tom Moulton. Now, my music friends, people who are really into music, will recognize this person because, well, first of all, they're a queer man fashion icon. But they're also one of the most important producers of all time, pretty much single-handedly responsible for inventing disco, for inventing the long-form instrumental break and the remix. Like, really profound creative genius, this guy, okay? And we're talking right at the start of disco. Disco is starting to become a thing, and he's the one, or one of the ones, who's helping to define that as a producer, you know? And this is the thing with disco that a lot of people don't recognize, is that it's coming out of this queer fashion culture. You know, it's made by queer people and Black people. You know, it's coming from that world. It's not that image that we have of Saturday Night Fever. You know, that's something that comes much later. But what happens with Grace is she's at this point kind of working between New York and Paris, kind of doing both now. She's exploded. Her music career is now happening on both continents. And she winds up working with this famous publicist named John Carman. Now this guy I need to go do more digging into him, because Grace Jones described him as a magician and said that he also was the publicist for Donald Trump. So there's some weird shit going on with this John Carmen guy, but I couldn't even find really anything about him. One of these people who purposely keeps themselves, out of the limelight while putting others in the limelight, But Carmen gets her set up with this fashion house run by this couple, Cy and Eileen Berlin. And these people are really interesting because they ran a fashion house, but at the time they wanted to transition into music. They saw that they could take their fashion icons and turn them into pop stars. You're starting to see that in the 60s, and they're really starting to push that up in the 70s. And they saw this new genre of disco as an easy way to do that, or at least they assumed it would be an easy way to do that. So they approach Grace and they say, we want you to be a disco songstress. We want you to make music for us. And they had this vision, the way Grace describes it, of like her eventually becoming like one of these Las Vegas lounge lizards, or like one of those like daytime TV pop stars, who does a variety show that you used to see in the 70s. But that's what her the people working with her wanted. And they managed to hook her up with this guy, Tom Moulton. And together they just create absolute magic, and things start to really kind of transform for her. What really sets it apart with this with Moulton is that when she first showed up, she didn't really this was something that was all put together by other people, right? Like, she did have a disco hit. She was kind of a club rat, but none of this was real. She wasn't really a real singer. And Tom Moulton is like a serious producer. So what I found really inspiring about this is that when Grace went in to become a musician, she took it super seriously and transformed herself. So Moulton had this to say about Grace. He goes, Grace had a real problem with her voice. She sounded like Bela Lugosi. She'd sing, I need a man, and it sounded like, I want to suck your blood. I said, what's with the accent? You've been watching horror movies? But she was incredibly aggressive and determined. Whatever it takes, I'm going to make it. And boy, she meant it too. At first I thought if she had the talent to match the determination, she could. But hey, she took singing lessons twice a week and she pushed herself. And I give her a lot of credit for that. She can sing, she really can. And there was just something about her. She was so unique. So kind of this crazy wild story of how she gets into music. And then another kind of interesting story is that at this time, disco clubs are starting to become all the rage. Tom Moulton is kind of like the biggest name in disco, and anything he puts a stamp on immediately becomes a big seller. And just so happens bootlegging is like a big deal at this time. And Tom, he made this song, a disco version of La Vie en Rose, and he never intended to release it because the original singer, she didn't want to be seen and typecasted as a disco diva. She was a white singer and didn't like the idea of being typecasted in something that was predominantly gay and black. Well, Grace Jones, being the crazy disco head that she was, happened to be out in the clubs and heard the bootleg version of the song by the girl that was never meant to be released. And she buys the acetate, doesn't know that it's made by Tom Moulton, and then shows up to Tom's studio, hands him the acetate to his own song and says she wants to cover it. So this is the story that he relates. Grace said, I want to do La Vie en Rose. I said, I don't give a damn what you want. We're not doing that record. I have a bad taste in my mouth from that song. Grace says, oh, but I have a record of how I want to do it. When I saw it was that acetate, I wanted to kill somebody. But she said she liked the sensuality of the track. So I said, I can have it done by tomorrow. She says, how are you going to cut the track so fast? I told her, it's my track. And then every single time she did La Vie en Rose on stage, she said, I want to thank that bitch for not signing that contract. Isn't that a cool story, though? Kind of
Yeah, it's hilarious.
You know, like, what are the odds of you going out to a club, hearing a song, loving it, buying the acetate, and then giving it to the original songwriter? You know, like, what the frig?
Yeah, it's so yeah, the coincidences are just they're too coincidental. And but it's also like it feels like who else but her.
Right? And what ends up happening is like Tom takes her music and he takes these stuff and he gives them these extended dance jams. Like we were talking at the beginning about her doing these 12-minute tracks where she just kind of stands provocatively and gets all that attention. This is where it begins, is with this guy. They re-record her song I Need to Man and they add a 7-minute instrumental break. This version has like a 5-minute instrumental break at the beginning before she even starts singing, where famously like she would do like almost like a Michael Jackson thing, because she talked about how she couldn't dance very well, so she got really into this kind of standing in frozen position. She'd just go up and stare at people, give them the death glare, and refuse to break it. You know, just and
Nice.
her death glare was so infamous at one point later on when she was working on the James Bond movie, A View to Kill. Roger Moore actually freaked out and got managers involved because she's like, she needs to break character. She's making me uncomfortable. She keeps looking at me like she's going to fucking kill me.
Yeah, I think the death stare is it works really well with like how angular her face is. And I don't think I need choreography. There you have it. You know, I mean, it's just like,
Right.
the shapes of her face. But I don't think that I would ever need a well choreographed Grace Jones dance as much as I would need to be stared at in that way.
Right? You want to feel dominated by Grace Jones almost. You go there for that power. That this is the cover of her first album here, Portfolio. So you can see she's starting to come into more of that androgynous look that we know her for, but it's still a few years away. So this is, I just thought, was an interesting quote showing you where she was at this time. She said, I was back on stage, styled by Yves Saint Laurent, singing La Vie en Rose to an audience who didn't want anything else to happen at that moment but complete and utter make-believe. I was dressed in make-believe and I sang a song about casting a magic spell, about being in a world apart, you know? So she really thought about this time, about disco, about that whole era, about is invoking this sense of this dream world, of entering into kind of like a cut off paradise for a few hours, you know?
Yeah, I think that just to emphasize that her relationship with Saint Laurent is really important for when we talk about the French sensibilities, because Saint Laurent really championed uh, bringing in Black women to the forefront of fashion. He was like, he had been the creative director for Dior, and then he did his own thing. And it's so obvious that Grace Jones's legacy would be tied in with somebody like Saint Laurent's, because he would have absolutely worshipped her. I can only like imagine,
Right. Yeah, no, that it makes perfect sense. And you're right. We need to talk about that because Yves Saint Laurent became one of the most defining brands in fashion. It still is.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Just to be a little bit more specific, though, what Saint Laurent brings is in the 80s at the time, you're having women come into the workspace. You obviously have this like sort of like, powerful kind of like um, executive, like boom, where people are going into offices and wearing suits and stuff. So he's the one who
power
creates things
shoulders.
like the shoulder pads, like the power shoulder pads. So he quite literally is like designing and working with and using people like Grace Jones as a muse. And in order to present this image of like a powerful woman who is going to be entering male dominated spaces and holding her own. So.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing. And at this time, she really starts to rank, like, just really gets into the performance aspect of her career. And she really like loved this aspect more than anything else. Like I said, she was first and foremost a club person, a club girl. That's where she got her start. That's where her element is. So this is a picture of her at a very famous New York club called Paradise Garage, which she's mostly associated with Studio 54. But she talks about how that was for rich people and that was for a lot of like the white people. Whereas like the real underground club stuff happened at Paradise Garage, or it happened at the factory, you
Yeah.
know?
Paradise Garage also was where house music kind of started, or at least one of the hubs for where house music started. So you're having all, and it started obviously at the tail end and utilizing a lot of like disco. So it's kind of an extension of disco and then transforms into its own thing. And here's Grace Jones again, like there, present for
Mhm.
these things. Not coincidence, of course. You need people like Grace Jones if these things are going to progress.
Right? So here's her describing the disco scene in New York. The classic New York melting pot mixture of personalities and ambitions, where there would be gays, blacks, Latinos, whites, straights, transvestites, celebrities, non-entities. It's like an acid trip without taking acid, where you are provoked to such an extent by all the metamorphosis going on around you that it seemed like the dress up, turned up people really did have horns growing out of their skulls, that there really were centaurs, angels, and devils, and that the music was the sound of sex, foreplay to orgasm, first kiss to the little death. Now, you've
Yeah,
experienced New York club life. What do you think?
yeah, this is exactly it. I mean, there's nothing better. Honestly, this is the thing that I feel like, it's not about going to like either just like a gay club or a straight club or whatever like that, right? It's about going into a space where things just get extremely bizarre in the most perfect way. There's nothing better, even if you're sober. There's just nothing like that transports you to another world when you see like a 7 foot, you know what I'm saying, alien creature, or like just things like this that you'll see when people go out and dress up to go to the club. It creates like an environment that is so special, right?
Especially
And
if you're
it's
going at these acceptive places, because you're going to get drag queens, you're going to get club kids, you're going to get the most weirdo creative people on the planet, right?
Yeah, you're gonna get some borings too, and they're kind of
Yeah.
necessary because they buy the drinks. But yeah, because if you're dressing up, you're not paying the cover fee, So um, yeah, so you need the borings too. They're welcome too, but again, like that experience that you're going to get by dancing next to like, an alien creature or a Nefertiti, right, in New York, um, is incredible. It's like everybody should experience that at least like once in their life.
I thought this picture was really good. This is another Paradise Garage one. So you have a guy in a loincloth, a bunch of normies all wearing like similar shirts, and they're all just there worshiping Grace Jones in her pharaonic royalty outfit,
Yeah, Nefertiti. It's nightclubbing Nefertiti in New York. She has the snake coiling all around her. That's
Yeah,
cool.
right? So badass. Here's another great image of her performing, this time at Studio 54. This one's really iconic. Um, just her in her glory. And I just want to read another quote. It says, "You have to separate the commercialized style of disco from the underground places where the ideas first appeared. Disco got a terrible reputation, like it was anti-music, but its beginnings were in many ways more radicalized, inclusive, and open-minded than rock. It was as much an assault on the corniness and narrow-mindedness of rock as punk. Where it ended up was the fault of the white, straight music business, which drained it of all its blackness and gayness, its rawness and volatility, its original, contagious, transgressive abandon." Well said, right? Because, like, this is something that irritates me. You know, Growing up, my experience of disco, because it wasn't my era, right? And I'm coming from rural Canada, was Saturday Night Fever. you know? And that movie is as white and as straight and as boring as it gets practically. It's nothing like Grace Jones. It's nothing like Donna Summers, right? You know?
Yeah, I think again, it's not that the whites, the straights, and the borings don't have a part and are not allowed to enjoy this kind of thing because it's anti them. It's just it's not going to be tailor made and catered in order um to appeal to them. You know what I'm saying? And so yeah, and then there's this whole people were there's I mean obviously it's before my time also, but there are stories about how I grew up hearing that disco sucks and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I didn't know why. I was like, whatever, I mean, it sounds good to me. I don't really get why, but it really seems like there was like a frustration in America to um, to make because disco kind of once it hit mainstream, it seemed like it was like a fad, and then it was like there was this huge anti-disco sentiment. It's just you can kind of see how it's the frustration of executives to like basically box in and keep up with the trends. You know what I'm saying? In order to sell it.
Oh, yeah. What I see is I saw three things at play with the whole anti-disco backlash, okay? Number one is what you've addressed, is that corporatization. Anything that becomes overly corporatized, you're going to saturate the market. You're going to suck out the life. You're going to reduce it, especially when you take something simple and pure, okay? Disco is very simple music. It's very repetitive. It's something that it can easily be obnoxious. And we saw what happened as a result of commercialization. Everyone knows Disco Duck. We've all heard it. And it's called one of the worst songs ever for good reason, And we also got to remember, like at one point in near the end of the 70s, near the beginning of the 80s, there was like thousands, not hundreds, thousands of disco radio stations in the US and Canada. Like overnight. It went a little bit way too much. It became a pop culture fad, right?
Right.
And then the second thing that we get is the backlash, right? This play on, like a lot of conservatives saw the disco movement as a way to drum up hatred against minorities and to use it as a political talking point, and to exploit it. And it wasn't just conservatives either. Everyone did it. You had rockers, people doing it to say, yeah, we're better than you. We're the tough. We're the big guys. It was all these people who felt threatened, who wanted to show their masculinity and show their strength. Disco became the punching bag, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think punching bag is the word that makes the most sense to describe like why so much hate for it.
And then lastly, just as a musician, right? Like I, there is some incredibly technical disco out there that's very well done, but at its root, it's a very simplistic genre. You can do a disco song with one chord. You can do a disco song with most of them are 3 chords, no changes, 7-8 minute instrumental breaks. It's not for everyone. And this is something I wanted to talk about is like, media doesn't have to be for everyone. Sometimes media can be black and gay predominantly. I mean, that's not to saying other people can't enjoy this. You can enjoy any media, like I enjoy things that are not meant for me or not made for me, I should say. Everything's meant for everyone, but sometimes art is made for a purpose or an audience. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if that audience isn't you, And like, I think with disco, that was a big thing. The white majority wasn't being represented for the first time in the mainstream, and they got bloody pissed.
Yeah, and people were trained to kind of see that as like if that's not what's happening, then there's something wrong, you know,
Yeah,
and it needs to be
exactly.
fixed. So
So here's another classic image of Grace at Studio 54. So this is interesting because so we talked about John Paul Gode. John Paul Gode becomes her husband, the father of her child, and becomes her longest running artistic collaborator. And I would say the biggest of her muses. So we saw the influence of Lopez, and then Issei or Miyake. And now we're going to see Gold really helps her kind of transform into something even greater. And Gold originally first meets her through seeing her as the disco diva at all of these club scenes. So this is from her book. I thought this was pretty good. It says, John Paul became more than intrigued with me and how I looked and what I might be like in bed. He would probe Glenn, who was her manager at the time, about what kind of men I liked and what turned me on. He was creating a fantasy about me even before we met. He saw me sing I Need a Man in front of a gay audience at a club with a bare torso and a prom dress. There was nothing pretty about it, nothing obvious. It was dramatically exhibitionistic. And there was a tangle of singles in terms of who was what and who was entertaining who. He was instantly captivated. I don't think he fancied my looks. He fancied my spirit. You know? So this is the thing. This is John Paul here. This is them later on. But he was, the way she describes her relationship with John is that Jean at first was in love with the idea of her. He loved her as an object. Like we talked about this, where she presents herself as something that's to be objectified, where she embraces that objectification. And she's very self-aware of this. And she encouraged this even with her lover, Jean-Paul, who this actually becomes a problem later on we'll get into. But they have such an interesting relationship where he saw her as a piece of art first and fell in love with that. That's such an interesting thing to me, you know? So at this time, she's gears up and she releases her second album, Fame. And this is really the beginning of her sort of her disco diva career. At this time, she becomes really good friends with Andy Warhol, Keith Harington, Divine, the drag queen, and a lot of other people who are kind of notorious in the underground art scene at this time. And, you know, Jean-Paul Gaultier was very much a philosopher and artist in himself. So he was bringing all this other stuff and introducing Grace to just this whole new world of material. So here she is again at Paradise Garage on a motorcycle with Divine in front. For those of you who don't know, Divine is sort of the quintessential drag queen. She was the first drag queen to really embrace being disgusting as like part of the gag, you know, and kind of took the whole drag performance to that ranched up campiness of an 11, you know. But just another important New York art figure, and it just shows how central Grace was at this time. Here's her. She's in costume for her single Do or Die. Again, she's still in her kind of her disco diva era here. Now, we're coming up. This is her last album that she does with Tom Moulton. It's called The Muse. And this is really when she's starting to break away from disco. She's getting frustrated with disco because she sees the outright commercialization of it. She sees a lot of these. She talks about in her book how it was really important for her to be seen as a singer, because so many of the disco singers would come out and they would just be a dancer lip singing to a DJ, you know, and she made it extraordinarily well known. No, I'm singing all of my tracks. My band plays my music, you know, or if I have a DJ, they're just playing the instrumental breaks. And she really wanted to bring all this performance into it. And she was kind of getting disillusioned with disco. This album also comes out in 79, which is the year of the massive disco backlash, you know, where people were burning their records. There's that famous, they pile up all these records in a stadium in New York and they set them all on fire as like a radio publicity at one point. It just gets absolutely ridiculous. Like, it's hard for us to imagine how much hate gay and black people were getting for disco. Like, they literally, tens of thousands of records were thrown into a pile and set on blaze. People were walking around with shirts that said disco sucks. You know, like, it was pretty intense. So just to kind of type off this disco era of hers, I really like this quote where she talks about her partying. She said, "I know that I was the wildest party animal ever. I pushed myself to the limit and started from there. I had no limits. If you asked me to do something, I would do it. Dare me. There was nothing I wouldn't try. Whatever it takes was my catchphrase. Experiencing life itself was the point. To propel myself out of my comfort zone. To feel alive. To take revenge on reality. I was the ultimate specialist in pursuing insatiable appetites and shameless lusts, even at the risk of disaster." You know? So just to highlight how intense this kind of risk of disaster is at this time, just some more iconic disco queen moments. We'll have one last one, talking about the garage here. She says, "The garage was a cult, like the church, but unrestricted and non-judgmental. It became a cliche to say so, but you felt it at the time. You'd hit the Holy Spirit, and if you go there, you are not going to dance. Get the fuck out. You had to be ready to sweat your ass off. Then you'd get close to God." So she really did view her role as a disco diva and performing in these things as like a religious experience, as a transformative thing, as a magical thing, as her home, you know?
Yeah, I agree with this sentiment like wholeheartedly, and I also would like say the same thing. Like, I don't think that there's any church or any religion really that's going to give you what you're going to get at a club or at a concert. And I think that anybody, like, think about any experience that you've had at a show, at a club, at a party or something, and really think about how incredible it was. Like, you've never had anything of that sort in a church
No,
ever in your life.
you would never get anything close to Grace Jones. And like, this is like something like she really embraced this and really felt it was important. This whole experience, this transformative experience about also embracing that celebrity and that image. She was really all about this. And, you know, at this point is when she starts to also meet up with Andy Warhol. So this is a picture that was taken by Andy Warhol, again at the garage. And if we look here on the far left, that's Keith Harington, Grace Jones. In the middle here is Afro jazz innovator Fela Kuti. And then on the right is graffiti artist and fashion designer, artist in his own right, Basquiat. You know, so this is like a who's who of some of the most influential artists of the time. You know, it's insane.
Yeah, between Grace Jones, Keith Haring, and then you have Jean-Michel Basquiat. It's like, again, it's like every image that you see of her is like it's her and Divine, and then like just the who's who of like iconic. I mean, who could be more emblematic of like, you know, the times and specific and even in New York than these two guys right here, right? Like,
right. And then like with Fela Kuti, this is tapping into that moment of like Black freedom and that African stuff that was happening in the 70s, Pan-Africanism and all these ideas. Like Grace is she's at the forefront of all of these musical ideas, and she's taking from everyone and really putting herself out there, you know?
yeah, when you think of that time period and you get these images in your head, those are the people who made them.
Right? So that image I just showed you was taken by Andy Warhol. And now here's Andy Warhol, Keith Haring, and Grace Jones, you know? And they became a huge thing. And she talks about how prior to Jean-Paul kind of having his visual impact on her, her early visual style in this disco era was all Keith Haring and Andy Warhol. Those were her biggest influences, pop art and the raw kind of animalistic body paint and stuff that Haring was doing. And she also talks about this one point where Andy actually pulled her to his side because she saw that she was getting kind of uncomfortable at one point because she was getting surrounded. So Andy Warhol was like obsessed with celebrity. Okay. He used to love to just attend parties and just watch people. And then people would be allowed to come talk to him if they were smart enough, he'd have people or entertaining enough, he'd have people come over to you and whatnot. But he would like watch all these parties, and he was talking about how he would watch Grace Jones, and he would see a couple times where she would get uncomfortable with her fans, and so he pulled her off to the side and tells her that, these people, they desire you, they worship you, they worship that image. What you represent on that stage is their fantasy, and everyone needs a fantasy. It's your job. What you do is to create the fantasy, to give them that fantasy. And after that moment, she said she never balked from a fan again. And she would spend like hours and hours after concerts signing autographs. And she used to make up like elaborate excuses to get out of it and stuff rather than disappoint people. Because again, she felt it was creating the fantasy and becoming the fantasy image was beyond important, and this mattered to her, like for her, it wasn't so much being objectified, but becoming fantastic. Right? And being someone else's dream and allowing someone else to have that dream for a moment, So many of us misunderstand that aspect of being this objectified being, of putting on a show for someone else's amusement. We, as the observers of the object, it's hard for us to understand the perspective of the object, But
Yeah.
she really understood it. She was an actress.
Muse.
Yeah,
That's the word.
100%. She made herself a canvas, and she allowed these creative people to work with her, and she took that and made it part of herself. It's a powerful, powerful stuff. So we'll keep going here. So this is a pop art piece that Andy Warhol did of her, one of his famous screen prints. He did this for a lot of different famous celebrities that he liked.
Yeah, he had his Warhol superstars, and she was a Warhol superstar.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes they were famous celebrities, and sometimes they were, street people. Andy was an interesting character.
And they were like the same thing for him, he felt like.
Yeah. 100%. So this is Keith Haring getting her dressed up to perform at Paradise Garage. So I really like this quote talking about her working with Keith. It says, "I remember once when he painted me for a photograph, I went where I was going next with the paint still on. If I could, I would go out wearing nothing but his paint, covered with Haring, his light and joy, his swoops and strokes, his handwriting. I would be dressed perfectly. As he painted me, I could feel myself change, become someone else, like my body, not my mind, was on an acid trip." Like, just profound, right?
Yeah, and the reverence that these people have for one another, to be working with one another, to be taking on, like for her to be taking on his work and becoming part of the work in a sense, and for him to have the like honor to work with her, like you can really see how it's like, how this is like synergy. You know what I'm saying? This is not like a request. This is not a like an order, sort of like a mail order thing. Like they're not phoning it in, I guess, with each other. Like they're really working with each other in order to make this happen and make this real. And you can really see the love that they have for one another. Just to kind of like, not to be bitter about it, but you can really see the difference between the Grace Jones and then the Kim Kardashian when you see not only the people who worked with Grace Jones talking about her, but her talking about the people she's worked with.
Right.
Like
to me,
it wasn't a job.
It's all summed up with Jean Paul, right? Why did he work with Grace? Because she was literally his muse, and he loved her. He fell in love with her as an object of his dreams. Okay.
Right.
Why did he work with Kim? Because she said he would steal it otherwise.
Yeah, a check. It was a check. You either cash it or you don't. Either way, she's gonna come and take it.
Right? Like very different worlds. So this is the final project of the painting that Keith Haring was doing. And then here's her performing at Studio Garage.
it's like the final form, right? It's like all been leading up to this like grand image. Incredible.
And like, this is before John Paul Gode. This is before she becomes the iconic image we even know, right? So I was interested in presenting myself as a singer in a way that broke away from what had quickly become a very narrow set of traditions. Most pop performance didn't take into account pop art or Warhol's films or a European catwalk or Japanese theater. There seemed to be many different ways of doing a concert where you could be influenced not by rock and roll or a soul review, but by minimalist art, expressionism, and avant-garde film. So this is where she's coming to disco from, you know? She was always into the discotheques. She was never a music snob, you know? And that's what she's into, is the minimalist art, the European catwalk, the Japanese theater, in Warhol, right? But what's wild about this is that none of this meshes with the image that we understand of disco. So this is where we're going to see when things don't work out for Grace Jones, or when she starts to feel trapped, she does radical things, right? So as a young person, she took off and moved to New York. Then again, she took off and moved to Paris on a whim. And now we're going to see her do something again on a whim, where she decides that, she's getting really frustrated. She feels kind of boxed in the disco world that she's working in with Tom Moulton and with Psy and Eileen Berlin. So she starts collaborating more with John Paul Gode, and they want to bring in all of these other elements of the theater, of transformation, of change, and all this stuff. And so they start collaborating together for the first time in a serious way, and they produce what becomes the most iconic image of Grace's career, which I'm sure we've all seen. And this later on goes on to be an album cover for a compilation record of best of record that she does called Island Life. But this was also featured in New York Magazine with a write-up by a really famous author, Nikki Cohn. But this is not a natural image. This is a cut-up image. So they actually had to take several hundred shots of Grace and then paste them together using tape and stuff. It's kind of wild how Keith manages to get these kind of images back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, it's actually kind of like a go-to technique for like illustration. I remember seeing like my professors in college and everything, like they would do that. And then I've also done it before, but you can do this like nowadays, most people just do it in Photoshop, but this is how you would do it before Photoshop was a thing. But it's not the Photoshop that we think of. Like people just want to edit their photos to look better. It's like you're literally pushing the boundaries in order to like create an image. Yeah. For this, you can't really like see the cut ups. There are pictures of the process of how they do it, of how he did it with these images. But then they also go and do this all manually, I guess in a dark room or something, and like fix it all together.
Yeah.
The amount of work that goes into making this, that went into making this image, and it's so specific too, is insane. But the payoff is obviously something that is so emblematic, like this picture.
We're talking about it, like 40 years later, right?
Right.
It's so iconic, you know, and this is the beginning of Grace Jones being truly transformed into that image, that icon, as we understand it.
Right.
So this is what she has to say about that photo. She says, that photo was where the photo of me naked and shining with one leg in the air came from. John Paul wanting to reflect in his way what it was I was doing and what Nick had seen. This brutal animalistic energy that was part disco, part theater of cruelty, two lucid ways of representing an appetite for life. It was a visual description of an impossible original beast, only possibly from this planet, a voracious she-centaur emerging from an unknown abyss and confronting people's fears. Perhaps in this image, you can see John Paul falling for me and turning it into a visual love letter. Like, that's so powerful and deep. There's so much going on here. First thing
My
I want to
God.
point out in this quote is theater of cruelty. Another magician I talked about on this show invented the theater of cruelty. That's Antonin Artaud. So she really is deep into the philosophy and this idea of the destruction of the image of the self and transforming that image for performance. She's thought about this far deeper than either of us have.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing is that she really knows. Like she's really kind of like eating this up, like taking this in, and then like regurgitating it and like really like putting it to work, metabolizing it, becoming it. It's crazy to see. Like I've never seen this kind of like I've never seen her own words like describing what was happening and to her during these times. This is insane. I mean, and even the way that she talks it makes so much sense.
Right? I love her voice really shines through in her memoirs. I can't recommend
Yeah.
them enough. Oftentimes when you read those, because it's the person talking to another author, sometimes the voice gets lost. Not Grace. The people she worked with, it's really well done. Yeah. So going on here's the New York spread that Nikki Cohn did. Now, this is a really important moment in Grace's career because up to this point, she is the disco queen. Okay. She's working for this Cy and Eileen Berlin couple, and they have this vision of wanting her to become the daytime kind of, variety show singer, the person who winds up in Vegas with a permanent residency act. To Grace, that was death, absolute death. And when she saw the ends of disco on the wall, when she saw where her bosses wanted her to go, she got together with John. She got together with this writer, Nikki Cohn, and she was very adamant in transforming her image in this moment. And this is the beginning of her going from disco queen to post-punk icon and really embracing that non-conforming rebellion. This article, she talks about farting. She talks about doing drugs. She talks about being promiscuous, right? This basically got her fired from her cushy gig as a disco queen, So it says here, Nick described me as the ultimate beast, a troublemaker out to disrupt harmony. He tore down all the soft, shiny glamour they were trying to drape around me. He ripped it apart and portrayed me as this hungry, horny, mannish animal, warts and all, thoughts and all. I loved it. This to me was glamour, not the maintenance of ordinary glamour, but something that was unknown, even occult, examining the idea of glamour based on its original meaning, witchcraft.
Yeah, this to me, I feel like it kind of really explains, like, this quote really explains why I'm so drawn to her personally. It, like, this to me shows that she understands and is working with what I relate, or at least what I can pick up on in her work.
Yeah,
Yeah, awesome.
it's extremely deliberate. It's extremely deliberate to the point where like we have this literal break where you have the end of this where she just finally says, you know what? No longer are you guys going to are going to put these flowers around me and try to paint me as something that can be sold. No, I am this provocateur. I am a figure of rebellion and of power, and I'm going to cast my own glamour. So she's taking the art that people are putting on her and she's totally making it her own. And she's using the artists around her to help her do it. Incredible writers like Nick Cohn and incredible photographers like her partner, Jean-Paul Gaude. So incredible. So at this point, because she does this article, she loses her contract with Cy and Eileen Berlin. She loses her disco record deal. So at this point, her company that she was doing the record deal with was kind of working with Island Records to distribute it. Like Island was a bigger distributing house, and so they were putting her records all across America. So her management had ties to Island and decided to approach Island Records to try and get her to become an artist. Now, Chris Blackwell is kind of an infamous figure within Jamaican music. He was there right at the beginning of ska in the 60s. He helped bring ska to the world. He produced the first #1 hit ska song, which was Millie, what's her name? Millie, I think it's Millie Smalls, My Boy Lollipop. And, but he's also kind of like a negative figure in some ways in Jamaican history because he became a billionaire. Island Records became one of the largest record companies, one of the big three. And it became so on the backs of Jamaicans. So it's such a weird thing. On one hand, he's a musical genius who transformed the world of music as we know it. Without Chris Blackwell, we would not have heard Bob Marley. We would not have heard ska. We probably wouldn't be talking about reggae in the same way we're talking. But he also ripped off a lot of people and stepped on a lot of people to get there. With Grace Jones, Chris, what he saw, when he was first brought Grace Jones, he thought, I don't want to do disco. I don't like disco. I'm into reggae. But her management persisted and was like, Grace Jones is not a disco diva. She's an artist, a real artist. And to prove this, they showed that picture and that article from New York Magazine by Nikki Cohn. And that image that John Paul made, that love image, sold her and got her connection to Island Records. And Chris, he was just like, disco is on the way out. It's dying. We want to keep you and your image. We want to keep your fan base, but we can't make a disco record. And we want you to become Jamaican. We want you to connect to your Jamaican roots and to incorporate more Jamaican sounds and stuff. This was ridiculously tough at this point for Grace because she had not been back to Jamaica since all of that abuse from her step-grandfather. And in her mind, she had viewed Jamaica in this extraordinarily negative light. But all of these people coming together really convinced her to do it and to go to Jamaica and to create a record. And what Chris did was he assembled like one of the best bands probably of the entirety of the 80s. He got Bob Marley's original keyboardist, Tyrone Gibbons. He got Sly and Robbie, the most prolific drum and bass recording duo in all of Jamaican music. And he produced the first record himself, you know? And so it was a huge deal. So this is what Grace had to say. Said that Chris took all my different worlds and stuck them all together to create the Compass Point All-Stars. That was the name of her backing band. The erotic French side, the acid-tripping rock and roller, the Jamaican drum and bass, the androgynous android electronics. It was magical, this assembly of pieces that fitted together. We would try out the mixes at the garage, which had the best sounds and most sophisticated system in the city, and therefore the world at the time. So famously, they would make mixes in Jamaica. Then she would perform them live at the garage, and they would gauge how the audience engaged with them and then remix them and remaster them so that they would better suit the club. So like her music was made with the club in mind, you know, very ahead of its time. So here is a picture of Sly from Sly and Robbie and two of the producers who worked on her album. And this was another quote that stood out to me because Grace is a musician, but she's not like a composer, singer, songwriter, really. She does bring elements and she does bring ideas, but she's always worked with others to create this stuff. So this I thought was pretty cool. She said, there was an art to all of this, as well as a science, and also something that is about magic. It's voodoo. Once those Compass Point mixes sounded right coming out of the garage speakers, we knew we'd cracked it. And what she means is that they had kit onto something new, onto a new musical moment. Now, it's easy for us to like discredit some of the stuff that she was doing because it is dance music. But if people are into dance music or into post-punk, Grace Jones is at the forefront of all of this. She's driving the image, she's driving the aesthetic, she's driving the sound. She's goth, she's disco, she's everything. She's so of the times in bringing in all of these incredible, intense images. You know, it's something that's so provocative. And what's really important here about this image is this is the first time that Jean-Paul Gaude collaborates with Grace, specifically within the music. So up until this point, all of that was handled by Sly and Eileen Berlin and that whole kind of industry type stuff for dealing her disco. But when it comes to this, Chris was sold based on that image he saw in New York Magazine. So while they were kind of skeptical at first, Grace was able to convince Chris and Island to give Jean-Paul complete visual control over Grace. So going forward, any image that is taken, any video, anything that they're doing, it's entirely decided by the combination of Grace and Jean-Paul. You know, no producers, no one else is involved. So this image, actually, Paul took of her because she's actually super pissed off and is pregnant at the time. And they were supposed to be doing like a samurai shoot, but they couldn't get her in a position where she didn't look pregnant, and she was getting super irritated. And he just loved this image and thought it was really evocative of this time and showed it to Chris. And Chris Blackwell fell in love with the image so much that this is what Grace says. We blew up the photo that was eventually used for the cover of Warm Leatherette. Me as an ominous, hard-eyed samurai filtered through something occult and African. The killer clown interrupting some mysterious ceremony. It was huge and covered the whole wall of the studio. Chris said to the band, make a record that sounds like that looks.
I love that. That's exactly like, first of all, good call on, you know, giving them complete control over their, you know, her image, and then also make a record that sounds like that looks. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? This is the thing. It's like, it's so interesting because Chris signed her not based on her music, but on her image. And then he created her music for her based on the idea they had of that image. You know, that image is everything to her. It causes the art, right? It causes the music, you know? Usually it's the other way around. So after that, we get into probably her most famous album. So this is the second album she did for Island Records. It was called Nightclubbing. And this image is probably the most famous image of Grace Jones besides the one we saw where she's in that ridiculous shape. This is her as kind of the androgynous android, you know, blacker than black to the point where she's purple, almost metallic. You have those 80s power shoulders that are so definitive of the image, you know, and the way she sits with that shirt, it's like those could be pecs or those could be breasts, you know, it's so powerful. And this is what she said about this particular image. She said, it was Jean-Paul inventing a new context for me to inhabit, as though Marlene Dietrich, Bertolt Brecht, and Piet Mondrian were as important an influence on pop as Elvis, as though music could be connected to art and theater. It was like the invention of a new genre, related to the musical, to opera, to circus, to cinema, to documentary, to the art gallery, to magic as well, because Jean-Paul was like an illusionist, creating magic tricks that somehow philosophically dislocated reality in my image and even my soul. Pretty profound, that.
Yes, like yes. Oh my God, I can't. My God, how fuck? Can you go back real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Wow. This is from her book?
This is from her memoirs.
Holy shit. Excuse me. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. I just needed to like catch catch it one more time. Wow.
So what's standing out for you? What are you catching?
Like everything, just the fact that like it was like he is sort of so just first of all, the thought that she is thinking in in the context of a space, right? Like a new context for me to inhabit. So the context is like a space, is like a like she is going to kind of bring in all of these things like Merlina Dietrich, which is obviously like it's just a lot. I mean, she's saying a lot of really incredible things here. Um, but I think the most important thing that I kind of got out of this is just that initial statement where you're getting she's thinking, or at least you can see that they're trying to express that they're thinking in like 4D or something, like where the image and the space is it metaphysical? I don't know if that's the correct word. How all of
Yeah.
these things, it's not like a space like a room. It's a space in a like a conceptual space, and then look at all of the things that she's bringing, and then what she's referring to it as being like magic and illusions and tricks and yeah, like I'm like reading it back and forth. I just love this. Like I need to read this now.
You do. It's such a good read, and there's so much that I can't bring. The thing with Grace that I really want to highlight here is that she is very mindfully creating new spaces, new genres of music, pushing the boundaries, and it's like a lot of people do that, but they don't do it intentionally. She sat out like she didn't just go and do an interview with someone for New York Magazine. She thought about how she could destroy her old career, create a new career, how she could create this whole image, and then it all played out the way she planned it. You know, like it's incredible to see this evolution that's coming together between her and Jean Paul. They really operating in this very synergistic mode at this point, you know?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
we get the next album here. Again, it's Jean Paul doing the art. And this is a full-on cutout. He cut her out and he purposely angles it. And he removed all her makeup to try and make her as masculine as physically possible in this one. And it's called Living My Life, this album, and it's just really intense imagery. And what she says about this one, I really liked. It goes, it was also about stripping back prejudice. It was about rejecting normal, often quite sentimental and conventionally crowd-pleasing ways of projecting myself as a Black singer and a female entertainer, because those ways had turned into cliches, which kept me pent up in a cage. I wanted to jolt the adult world that is traditionally led by bland white men, to shatter certain kinds of smugness through performance and theater. I never really thought of myself as Black, so it wasn't as though I consciously decided that I would behave in a way that Black people didn't usually behave. In America, they tried to force me to be, in their eyes, a traditional Black person, to limit myself to the limitations imposed from outside on Black Americans. But I didn't want to go there. It seemed that would make me act like a victim, like the inferior person that they wanted me to be by dismissing me as Black, ruled by the language of the prejudiced. I wanted to be ruled by my own language, my own way of putting and seeing things. So even the rejection of image is a part of her image. And this return to the self of this plain African, she embraced that masculinity of hers. She embraced those non-white elements. And it's
Yeah.
really important and powerful.
Well, you can kind of see that for her, it's almost like she didn't have any choice because she didn't see herself in that way. And I think that
Yeah.
this again goes to show how she's looking as an outsider to like what uh what is like black in America, right? And she's like, well, I don't really see myself as that, and I don't know why I would want to like shoehorn myself into that in order to gain an audience. And sorry, I'm like reading it back. Yeah, so she even says like the inferior person that they wanted me to be by dismissing me as black. So it's kind of like, why set yourself up for failure in a way? And I wanted to be ruled by my own language, my own way of putting and seeing things. Yeah, like I think this is a good kind of way to show how we were talking about like how how she was embraced in Europe more than she would have been. And there's a history of this, and you can kind of see how she's thinking, like she's not even thinking, she's almost like, I'm not gonna do this. Like, why would I do this,
Right. Like this is an ongoing thing. She talks about even later in the book where she's like, she never even saw the barriers, or she never recognized the barriers as being there. She kind of just ignored them or pretended they weren't there, and that was almost a power in and of itself. you know she like just
Yeah,
kind of like flaunted them. That was her approach to dealing with them, was to flaunt them.
yeah, it's not this idea of like, removing herself from her blackness as much as it is to not be limited by other people's expectations, or like how they are okay digesting that.
You know
So
what
it's
it is
not,
fundamentally with her? She's herself.
yeah, so this is not like an anti-black thing as much as it's like whatever you guys keep like trying to shoehorn black people as in America, like I'm not gonna do that.
Right?
I'm not gonna
And by
be that
just
for you.
being herself, she happened to
Yeah,
expand that image, right? She made it easier for people who look like her. you know it's powerful
yeah,
stuff.
for sure.
So let's keep going. So at this point, she and this is basically sort of the height of the collaboration between Grace and Jean Paul. They work on this long form music video called A One Man Show. It's about 40 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. It's incredible. And it's not just a live video, but it was also turned into a live performance art piece that she then toured on her first world tour. And this was like a huge deal for her, So here's what she has to say about One Man Show. The unmoored power that people recognize in the one man show is possibly because I was simply being me, not thinking about the color of my skin or my sex. I was outside race and gender. I considered myself an energy that had not been classified. Just embracing that non binary kind of identity before that was even really an identity, And here's an image from the live show. She would tour this around, this whole getup, looking like, a piece of avant-garde art. I just love it.
Yeah, who did this?
So all the art was still done by Jean-Paul Gaultier at this point.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So they're coming up though. Things are starting to get dicey for them. It says, I really like this quote too. It says, theatrically, I was not thinking. This is a way of finding a different way to be black, lesbian, male, female, animal. I didn't want my body language to betray my origins. I wanted to use my body to express how I had been liberated myself from my background, ignored obstacles, and created something original based on my own desires, fears, and appetites. I was using my body as a language that comes from a dark continent, and dark is dangerous. I absolutely love this particular one because she's liberated herself, and it's not about becoming anything but free. And what she wants us to do is to learn how to free ourselves, how to know ourselves, and to explore those images of the self on our own, to do what she does. It's such a profound thing. You know, she really embraces that Dionysian kind of magic, I think.
Yeah, embracing my body as a language. Again, it's using imagery as magic, as like your kind of like magic wand, I guess. Based on my own desires, fears, and appetites. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. So at this point, this is where things start to get a bit dicey between Jean-Paul Gaude and Grace Jones. So at this point, she's had her first child, and she's gone on the world tour. Her and Jean-Paul never got married. You know, they weren't those kind of people, but they were in a monogamous relationship. Now, she's on the world tour, and it's extraordinarily hard for her. She's talking about how she's alone, how it's exhausting every night, and how she needs someone. She needs companionship, and she needs it badly. So one night she calls up Jean-Paul and she begs him to come to Australia to be with her. And Jean-Paul refuses. He's too invested in creating the next music video that they're working on. And he, in her mind, the way she talks about it in the book is that at this point, he was still in love with her as an object. He loved her as the art piece more. And this was unacceptable to her. She called out to him in a cry of desperation when she needed companionship, and he said no, that the art was more important. And her, in her desperation and her vulnerability, turned to someone else. Just so happened that someone else happened to be this beautiful man here, Mr. Hans Lundgren at this time, or Dolph Lundgren. Now, he was happened to be like a fashion person kind of on the peripheries, and she connected to him through friends and instantly fell for him because she saw him as this big, gentle giant. And like she said, she was incredibly alone and broken down on this tour, and she needed companionship. She needed someone to confide in, and Dolph was right there and willing. And it wound up ruining the relationship between Jean-Paul and Grace. They continue to collaborate for a number of years. They do have a child together. They stay close. She does try to reconcile with him. She says, look, I did cheat on you, but I warned you. And I do love you. And if you can get over it, I'll stay with you. But at that point, John says no. So she stays with Dolph, and they continue working together, and they become very close. And actually, what's kind of interesting is Jean-Paul saw their relationship as an art piece because he still viewed Grace as his muse. And he saw the contrast between these two figures as something that had to be turned into art for the world to see. So even as he's breaking up with the love of his life, he's photographing her with her new lover because of the art. Just to show you what kind of person Jean-Paul Gaude is. So these are some of these images that he took, and they became incredibly iconic images, This black and white, these two, gentle giants. But it's sad because it did end their career. At one point, Grace goes back to Jamaica to start working on the next album. She's with Dolph. Basically, Jean-Paul comes there and convinces Dolph to leave, and then tries to get Grace to marry her again. But at this point, she's now moved on. And it's kind of like the final nail in the coffin of their whole arrangement. And, this is kind of it's a good thing and it's a bad thing, because Grace really kind of continues to grow and transform. She's not someone to be held down and to be defined by anyone. We look at the media places her time and her relationship and the work she did with Jean-Paul Gaude as kind of like the be all and end all of her career. But as I've shown you, it's only like a very small window of her career where she's working with Jean-Paul in a very intimate way. And he's building off of an image that she had already been constructing for all this time, and that she'd already constructed with all these other incredible artists before he was even on the before he was even in the picture, you know? And she goes on creating well after he's gone. So, but one of the things that happens is that Jean Paul always wanted to be a movie director. He was obsessed with, like, he wanted to do this. I go from doing fashion and photography and commercials to doing high art. And he watched a collaborator and a friend of his, Ridley Scott, do this and become huge, right? And Ridley Scott famously goes on to make Blade Runner, many other movies. Well, he actually wanted to cast Grace Jones in Blade Runner, and he wanted to cast her as the Snake Woman. It would have been so freaking awesome. But Jean-Paul got in the way and told her not to, because he was super jealous of freaking Ridley Scott and wanted her to wait for his film.
Well, now I'm kind of mad about that
Right?
because I think that that's such a cool. It would have been perfect because I think that the Snake Woman, it needed a strong image, right? There's no lines, I don't think, for her in the movie, right? Or maybe very few. It's really about like her presence. And Grace Jones, that's what she does. She's done a whole movie where she's just a presence. And that's one of my favorite movies, I'm not gonna lie, Blade Runner, and I can't really remember the Snake Woman in my mind. And
She's
I'm
very
like,
small role.
yeah, like why I guess okay, he's jealous, but at the same time, like if he can take pictures of Dolph Lundgren and Grace Jones together, why couldn't he let her be in the movie?
Well,
That's a
she talks about
weird
it in the
thing to
book.
me.
They had this whole big debate about it, where it was all about, are you going to be compromising your vision? Are you going to, that artist thing? They're high artists, John Paul and Grace
Right,
Jones.
right.
And he got her convinced that it would be cheapening her. So because of that, she was so being Grace Jones. If you tell Grace Jones not to do something, the next time she's going to do it. As soon as she broke up with Jean Paul, she had to get into movies now. And
Yeah, okay.
she got the call, and that's why she does James Bond, A View to Kill. And she's Mayday. That's her name as a James Bond villain. And I already relayed that story of her death glare making Roger Moore so uncomfortable that he had to get the director involved. But like, this really kind of put her into the mainstream in a way that she had been iconic. People started to hear her music, they started to see her in music videos, but this really put her into the white man mainstream. Now she's next to Bond. Now everyone has to react to her. So it's a very interesting moment for her. But she really hated Hollywood, and she did not like that experience at all. And this is what she has to say about Hollywood in general. She goes, here's a message, a strong message. This place is not for you. This place is going to be the death of you. It's a place that is cursed and that perhaps goes all the way to the earthly fallout of the Big Bang that created everything. It is dead earth, dry earth, a desert never meant to be built on. It is such a destructive place, and if you have to go there, go only for a short while and make sure you protect yourself. Otherwise, they will suck you dry.
I'm not gonna lie, I've had this same exact, almost word per word feeling about Hollywood.
Right? Right? No, she went there and she saw them immediately trying to consume her. And so she was very quick. She never moved she moved to Hollywood briefly for like a year with Dolph, because Dolph wanted to start his career, and it ended their relationship. So it was like, she really hated Hollywood, and she tried to warn Jessica Lange about Hollywood. Like, she has a whole bunch about it. Even this whole experience, you had mentioned this film. So she does this movie. It's kind of like a weird horror surrealist comedy. And she doesn't say a single word in the entire movie. She's just like this creepy seductress vampire, right? Do you have any thoughts on the movie, Pierrot? I know you love it.
I think it's just a great I think it's a great display of how she uses her presence and her image to just captivate an audience, you know, and how again, like if she had been in the movie in Blade Runner as like the snake, I'm mad about that. But if she had been in it, you can see how perfectly she would have done because of the movie like this, because of how well she can carry, a scene on just the way she looks and the intensity of how she delivers her presence alone.
Oh yeah, like it's crazy. They have her right like there's a couple scenes where she's on a stage and she's like writhing around and it's like you don't think that you would be so engaged, but she does that for most of the movie and you can't look away. It's well worth watching. I actually included a musical clip from the movie. We have a playlist of all of favorite songs I have of Grace Jones. So you can actually go there and see the clip. There's also the full movie on YouTube. Just search Grace Jones Vamp and you'll find it. So this is an interesting moment. This was a quote because basically Grace Jones, she breaks up with Jean Paul. She's broken up with Dolph. She's doing all this kind of weird Hollywood stuff. She's at a weird moment in her career where everything is starting to explode and the hands are coming out. The real big money is coming out. And hindsight is a wonderful thing. And she now recognizes it, at least at the time she's writing the memoirs, that she shouldn't have done this. But she decides to leave Island Records and to break with Chris Blackwell and instead to go to Capitol because they offer millions and millions of dollars for a multiple album contract. More money than Island could ever offer her at this time. Island is yet to be one of the big three, So she sends this offer to Chris, and Chris is deeply hurt, but he tells her, I could never offer you the money, so take it. But this is what she had to say. It was a heartbreaking moment for both of us. I was in tears. I took the money, but I should have resisted the temptation. It was emotional turmoil, and I learned my lesson. Don't always go for the money. So this was actually the beginning of the end of sort of Grace's career as a musician at this point. So this is the last collaboration she does together with Jean Paul Gaultier. And this is the last of the musical projects that she releases through Island. It comes out on Capitol, but Island and Chris Blackwell and the Compass All-Stars were still involved. And this is widely considered to be her greatest album. It's her most critically acclaimed. It's a post-punk masterpiece. She really pushes the boundaries of dance, of reggae, of punk, and she creates something totally unique to Grace. It's a must-listen to record, in my opinion. It's practically perfect, I know music is subjective, and that's my subjective opinion. And I absolutely love this cover because, again, we get to see that Jean Paul Gaultier technique on display, but this time he's left the seams in. So now you get to see how he does his Photoshop without Photoshopping, how he extended her mouth into that shape, into that monster, and made her hair into a mohawk. It's Photoshop, but done through cutouts. They literally cut her up and make her into something new. So this is what she had to say about that image. So he, Jean Paul Gaultier, extended the last big scream, the final push, the birth moment, made my mouth impossibly open, made a still picture appear to be in motion, capturing an extraordinary part of our lives and turning it into art. So what she was saying is that he was inspired after seeing her give birth to their son. And that image of her contorted in this way of extreme pain that he thought could never even be replicated, that he had to turn her into a monster to show the same pain of birth. Just really powerful stuff, I thought. And again, it's that the intimacy between them is what created that incredible art. You know, that first cut up was a love letter to her, and now this one is a love letter to their child, you know? Just love it. And here's a famous image from the music video to Slave to the Rhythm, where they actually built a giant Grace Jones head. It's pretty crazy. And at this time, again, she's doing more Hollywood stuff, and she was able to get the role in Conan the Barbarian. And she became close friends with Arnold, and she actually dated her co-star, this guy Sven, who's like a Swede at this point during this film. But again, she really loved this idea of being this powerful Amazonian woman, of being someone who's truly strong and could take on the world. She then goes on to release her first kind of solo Capitol album, and we can immediately see a great kind of departure, right? Like the last album that John Paul Go did, we got this incredible high art image. And then when we get to the next Capitol image, we have something that is so 90s, even though we're in the late 80s, you know? And the album is not bad. There's a few tracks that I like. It's famous because she gets the guitarist from Chic to produce it, who's like a disco god. But again, the album, it's probably her most like hyped album. She does this incredible music video with Keith Haring, you know, for I'm Not Perfect, but I'm Perfect for You is the song. And they really spent all this money and all this pomp, but the public just didn't catch on. It lacked that intimacy that the other projects had. And her final musical project at this point with Capitol is this album here. It's called Bulletproof Heart. And she makes it with this guy, Chris Stanley. And this is kind of like the darkest moment of her life at this point. You know, she's lost Dolph. She's lost Jean-Paul Gaude. She gave up her dream band for the money, and it's not paying off. She's living in Jamaica, but she's isolated. She's taking a lot of drugs, and she's really kind of alone. She's hooking up with this guy, Chris Stanley, who's an amazing producer, but things take a turn for the worse. AIDS comes out around this time. You know, this is the late 80s, early 90s, and people start dropping dead and getting really sick. And, you know, Grace is an icon in the queer movement, you know? So she loses a lot of people who are close to her at this time. Famously, Keith Haring dies right after making their music video. She wasn't even able to be there. And Chris Stanley gets sick while they're recording this album. And she winds up having to spend the last few weeks with him, taking care of him while he's dying of AIDS in Jamaica in his mansion. And famously, the Jamaican police raid the mansion and try to have him arrested and charged for drugs as he's dying of AIDS. And they also, like, Grace is there to take care of her sick and dying friend. And they arrest her, charge her with possession for, we're talking tiny bits of grams that they find in her purse. And she has to pay an extraordinary amount on bail to get out of jail. Stops her from going to Jamaica for almost 2 years. You know, Chris winds up dying before any of this even gets resolved. But this whole experience, seeing all these people die of AIDS, just the absolute intensity of everything, losing all of that connection to the music world and to herself, she decides to just give it up. She abandons music and she kind of takes a step back and decides that she's going to take time to raise her son and she's going to live a life for herself. And so begins basically a 19-year hiatus that she takes. She does come back at one point, and she releases an album with Pavarotti, which is pretty funny. I mean, it's an amazing achievement for her, but like, the last thing I'm interested in personally, you know. She also famously got to meet Nelson Mandela. She talks about in the book how she fulfilled her father's dream. She took him and got him to speak with Nelson, and they prayed for the state of Africa and for Black people. And like, this was one of the most proud moments of her entire life, was getting to do that, you know. But once her son kind of came fully of age, and she divorced, she does get married at one point, but it was kind of a lackluster marriage. She doesn't really talk much about it in the book. She decides to go back to music 19 years later, and she releases this album, Hurricane. I believe it would have been like 2008, I think it comes out. I can't recommend this album enough. I absolutely loved it. I had never heard it until I decided to do this project with you, but I've been rocking it this entire couple weeks. There was one song, the title track, called Hurricane, and I just wanted to share with you guys the opening lines, or the main chorus line. It says, "I am woman, I am sun. I can give birth to she, I can give birth to sun. And I can be cool, soft like the breeze. I'll be a hurricane, ripping up trees." And there she is. This is from 2023. This way Pierrot and I had mentioned at the beginning of our talk here, her doing her crazy 20-minute extended hula hoop performance. Going to town. Her again, this is in 2020 with her iconic mohawk. You know, and I just wanted to leave you guys with this last word from her, which says, "My biggest success came not because I was chasing it, but because I was following through on my impulse to change." You know, so that's basically most of her career. You know, she did a lot of art and a lot of movies as well, but that takes us up to now. So what do you think, Pierrot? Do you have anything to add?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was charging my headphones. They died. So I just charged it a little bit so we can get the last of this live stream in. But yeah, I think that I really like that image, by the way, of her doing the hula hoop, specifically the one that you chose, because she's done different looks for that performance. Because she has this like star shape to her head, right? And then she has this like ring. And to me, just like in the esotericness of all of this, like that's a really striking image. That's an image that's come up for me again and again and again, of this woman sort of like, doing her, like this star woman doing her little dance and, making the world move.
She who is clothed in sunlight, right? From Revelation.
Yeah. Right. So I really like this one specifically, and then she's singing the song like "Slave to the Rhythm," which is like kind of talking about like these patterns of life, I guess, to put it crudely. So I think it's just really perfect. I think this is like a really perfect image to kind of end on, or at least this is like this to me. I wish I could photograph her or something. Like I wish I could like Jean-Paul Gaultier her. Because how fantastic, and it's like she's already doing all the stuff that I want to do anyway, or at least some of the images that I want to use like this. So I love this picture. I think this is like the perfect one to end on for me.
Yeah, share your screen and I'll put it up.
What's that?
If you share your screen, I'll put it up.
I mean, I can see it. It's up in the...
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, this image. I thought you said you had another one. Never mind. That's my bad.
This one.
No, you're right. I think I agree, right? This is the perfect image, right? It shows you, too, what she does as, we talked about on our second episode, Yoko Ono. And Yoko Ono's art is very different, even of like her magic. They're operating, you can see how they're operating in the same wheelhouse. They're doing the same thing.
Sure.
They're invoking this transformation, But with Grace, it's far more personal, right? And with Yoko, it was far more about instructing others what to do, trying to help other people heal their pain, trying to get other people to engage and not telling you. Whereas with Grace, she's presenting herself and is asking for a reaction, you know?
Exactly.
You know, she's using herself. She's showing you what you could be, what you could do. She's showing you an alternative. Oh, you don't need to follow those gender binaries. You don't need to follow even those human binaries. You know, you can be and contort yourself into anything. You know, you can become the fantasy, and the fantasy is okay, right? One thing I love about Grace is she embraces the fantastic and asks you to join her in the fantastic for a moment. It may only be for a moment, but that moment is profound, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of the goal, or it's something to strive toward in like a really profound way, right? It's kind of like what
Exactly.
you should be like if you're getting these sort of these images or these impulses, you should explore them because that's gonna make life, it's gonna give your life meaning.
Right. And this is the thing, too. Like Grace talks about this a lot about walking this fine line of pushing yourself, of not being afraid and taking risks, but also not being self destructive, having this love, having this. She doesn't use that language, but to me, it sounds so much like she found the muse and she's following and trusting in the muse. You know, she's letting the art guide her, you know?
Well, she is the muse. She's like
Yeah.
embodying it.
Yeah. Right. She's drawing down the stars. She's inspiring the world, inspired everyone around her, right? And that's the other thing I wanted to highlight is like oftentimes magic it's not about what you do, it's about what you cause to happen, right? It's what you inspire, right? You know, so she's playing with images, but what have those images created? You know?
Right, exactly.
And it's shifted the entire narrative. What does it mean to be sexy? What does it mean to be powerful? What does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be male or female? She makes us all question those well-defined categories within our society. But she also, by making us question those, she exposes the absurdity of it, right? You can
Yeah,
do whatever you want. You can become a Grace Jones, you know?
yeah, well, she also says that like these things, she uses really harsh words in one of the quotes that you showed before, and she says, this is glamour. I'm expressing glamour. I'm
Yeah.
expressing like beauty, and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what like I feel like when look at Grace Jones, right? Like, for example, something if we say something is primitive, right? Especially if we're talking about like somebody who's like black and then being compared to or described that as primitive. And it's like, well, why is that like a bad thing? That wasn't a bad thing when Picasso was doing it. That wasn't a bad thing when,
Yeah, true. Good point. Or Mondrian or
nobody
anyone
was
who's
like,
doing.
yeah, when they were finding this stuff and they weren't thinking that way either. So like, why is it bad for her to express herself that way and for her to see that as like to see that as glamour rather than it like being like she's like all the filth, all the heart, like this like this like sexual prowess that you're not supposed to really show and stuff. Like this is what I want to express. Like why is that
Right.
bad, I
And
guess, or why is that not something that is glamorous? She obviously is probably one of the most glamorous people to ever walk this earth, and this is what she's using, this is what she's bringing
right.
up.
No, and she loves it, right? Like she embodies glamour and sees it as a positive thing. And in our culture, they constantly tell us, and this is something that's a huge point for me because I think beauty and aesthetics are worth pursuing, that it's a moral good to pursue them. But our society tells us the exact opposite in every way, you know?
Yeah, and I want to be like, okay, I want to put out this message, right? By doing this show. No,
Yeah.
absolutely not. Like aesthetics, like even when you were talking before about you were showing the quote where they were like trying to like package her into the music world. They were like, okay, look at this image, right? I want something that sounds like this. Like this is what the image, like to me, I understand that too. I understand this kind of like, but for some people it's like, oh, it's just like a pretty face, or you can't just like, no, you can use those things and build upon them. And um you can work backwards, I guess, right? Like you don't need to create an image for like the sound as much as you could work from image to create a whole thing. And like this is what muses do with their beauty when they're like utilizing their self, their image, their presence and all of this stuff. And obviously Grace Jones, I guess if we were to like package it, right? Like what has the show been all about? At least for me, it has been that how the power of like a living, breathing muse can do all of this.
Yeah. And what does it mean to be a muse too? Is to embrace that transformation and to allow other people to transform you. You know, like
Yeah.
so much of her is about making herself vulnerable, putting herself on display, allowing herself to be in someone else's fantasy, but also maintaining that control. What I find so incredible about Grace Jones is that she can she doesn't become the object. She becomes the fantasy. She controls the fantasy. And if you try to turn her into an object, the fantasy is over, you know? And there's a big difference there between her and then someone who's being just treated less than. She's purposefully invoking that glamour. She is calling it down. She wants you to see the image that she's presenting, you know?
Hmm.
And like, and also I want people to recognize with these, like one of the big things about this is like so often we look at these women, whether it's like Yoko Ono or Grace Jones, and we say, oh, you know, they're not smart. They don't know what they're doing. You guys are extrapolating. No, we're not. These women know exactly what they're doing. They're connected to brilliant artists. They're well read. They know it and they're bringing it. And we need to start acknowledging that, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but also I don't think we should also underestimate their ability to play into this kind of expectation of them being dumb and completely playing and your intelligence and your wit in order to get what they want also.
Oh,
And at that point, you kind of ask for it, to be honest.
100%. You see that a lot with Yoko Ono. You do see it too with Grace Jones. But what strikes me about Grace Jones is that she refuses to even play the game. She's just like, you know what? The race thing doesn't even matter. I'm going to address it in my book maybe once or twice. It's not an issue for me. It's an issue that people have about me.
Yeah, it's an issue for you.
Exactly. And how she just was like, you know what? I'm sure people were talking about it, but I didn't give a fuck and I never paid attention and I just went on, you know?
Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, the whole thing about like it being an issue for it's not an issue for me, it's an issue for you. When you were describing her childhood, right? And how she started kind of seeing the goofiness around her, right? And she was like, "Oh, it's the people who have the problems and stuff." I can relate to that because even in like these, Christian environments and stuff like that that I had contact with, I could always see that it was always like their mess, and I was like even like when they try to, to get you, to shame you for like whatever they feel like shaming you for, I mean, I was always like, why? Like, why do I need to feel bad for all of this? Like, what the fuck did I do, And it
Right.
seems like she had the same attitude. And so I like this kind of like the problem is not me, it's you seeing problems with this. Like, it doesn't need to be a problem if you don't make it a problem. I'm not making it a problem.
Right. And I also
Um,
love how she was able to, like, you see this with so many powerful people. With just about every artist has a story like this where they take their trauma and they use it to fuel them. They use it to become the defining factor that pushes them forward. And what we see with Grace is she takes that early childhood trauma and she's like, I'm never going to allow anyone to oppress me like that again. Someone tries to hold me back, I'm going to push myself. You're saying I can't be a model, I'm going to go to New York. saying I can't make it in New York, I'm going to go to Paris. You know, I'm going to be a musician. I'm going to go to Jamaica. Like again and again and again, she's like, as soon as people tell her no, that's when she transforms herself and makes it work, you know?
Right, right.
So this is an ongoing thing. I just want to end with the key to these powerful women is that they know themselves, they seek themselves, they try to help others do the same, and they're in that powerful embrace of change. You know, that's the things that unite all of these witches, I believe.
100%.
Right? So thank you guys all for tuning in to our show on Grace Jones, fashion icon, musician extraordinaire, performance artist, and just overall badass. So thank you guys. And I highly recommend you all check out her book, Not My Memoirs. Worth reading, 100%. Any last words you want to leave it on, Pero?
I just want to thank everybody for spending the time and, you know, listening to us and sharing with us. I'm always kind of like checking the chat also. And I think a lot of people have interesting things to say. So it's cool to see, you know?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you all for coming. Please like and
Yes, thank
subscribe.
you.
And you know, we will be back again soon with another incredible, powerful artist, witch figure to discuss here on Myth and Pop Cult. I'm not sure who we're doing next. Do you have any ideas? Or
There's so much, right? That's the
right?
thing is it's always hard to narrow down because there's so much, but we'll figure it out and then we'll let you know.
Also, if you guys have any suggestions for powerful
Yeah,
figures, specifically, we're looking for people who are forgotten or who are not seen as powerful magic users. You know, they don't have
discredited.
to be
Yeah.
women or people of color, but you know, people who are ignored. You know,
It could
or
also
whoever
be
that
like, yeah, events, topics, certain
anything.
things. I know that, like, for example, there are certain things like comic books that we want to talk about. I'm not like a comic book person, but I know that like Wretch is, so it'd be great to like bring him. And I know that you are too. So musicians, events, time periods, things like that.
Any kind of
So
interesting people and who are doing in cool things or cool art projects. One thing that Rich and I really want to talk about, you got to play this video game, is Ultima 7, which was one of the
yeah,
first role-playing
yeah.
games. But the amount of
Hillary
deep
Clinton.
mystery lore in that is
God.
absurd. Richard Garriott is kind of a weirdo, but he claims he has read every single work of classic literature, and I'm kind of like, I wouldn't be surprised if that were true.
Yeah, somebody said Hillary Clinton. Yeah, I don't.
Not touching that with a 10-foot pole. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to do Hillary Clinton
I
out
don't
of
want to
all
do.
people.
I don't want to do
That was
people who are
crazy.
outright engaging in very manipulative, self-serving magic.
Not Hillary. That's, that's
You
Hillary
know
Clinton though. Like,
exactly. So I don't
listen.
want to talk about it. She is very. Trump is very clearly a witch. Hillary is very clearly a witch. I do not want to talk about them on my platform. You know.
Yeah, that's
So
dark sided. Yeah, dark
yeah.
sided. That's dark sided
Dark
stuff.
sided. No, but I would love to talk about the Ultima series just because it goes deep. Specifically, the 7th game where they have a black gate. They have a secret, weird Christian cult called the Fellowship, like that's orchestrating murders. At one point, a guy gets crucified, and you have to save the little boy who is going to be killed in this ritual that got stopped. And his name is Spark, and you have to take him around. Like, there's so much deep ritual stuff going
I
on in
thought his
that
name was
game.
Amon.
The little boy is Spark in this game. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the
Yeah.
guy who has to save his. Okay, got it. Amon. That's it. Okay, got
But yeah, no, check out Ultima 7. It's worth playing. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, guys, thank you all for tuning in to the 3rd episode of Myth and Pop Cult. And we'll be back again with another amazing witch figure. So thank you guys. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Peace, love.
Yes.
Hail Satan.